there aren't really any Brexit experts. The thing about this talk and talking about Brexit in general is the overriding theme is about uncertainty. You should beware anyone who confidently tells you they know how any of this is exactly going to play out. Nobody does. That uncertainty is compounded in the short term by the election, and in the long term by the sheer inscrutability of the Prime Minister. We only found out a week ago that we were going to have an election, having been assured by her that we weren't. So we've, we work from the signals that have been given so far, but it's always worth bearing in mind that these things can be turned on their head at a whim. That's a non-exhaustive list of things related to the NHS that could be affected. The thing that I forgot to put on there, that I should have put on there, is clinical trials, which are, as far as I understand it, regulated centrally across the EU level, and are really, really important in the NHS, particularly to the big teaching trusts. I'm not going to talk about all those. The really, really important thing for the NHS about Brexit is what the effect is going to be on the economy, what the effect of the economy is going to be on the tax take, what the effect on the tax take is going to be on the public finances, and then onto the NHS budget. There's also the idea of a Brexit dividend. I don't think anybody thinks it's going to be £350 million a week, but there are implications from the Brexit process of the funding of the health service long term. There's nothing really helpful you can say about that at the moment, apart from that that's a factor. So what I'm going to concentrate on in this talk are three things. One is competition and procurement, one is workforce, and the other is the regulation of medicines and medical devices. Two of those have been marked as major areas for concern at a high level in the NHS. Not that one. That one's the red herring. So the first thing to say is that there are kind of mixed messages, if you like, from the senior leadership of the NHS on competition and procurement. On the one hand, we hear that local leaders, commissioners are told you don't have to tender everything, and local leaders don't tender everything. Not everything is subject to competition and procurement. On the other hand, it's pretty clear that where there are innovative new models of care, that where those are to be supported by contracts, for instance, the MCP contract, ACOs supported by the PACS contract, if that ever gets published, that those will be subject to a fairly tight, onerous assurance process. So there will continue to be competition and procurement, although not necessarily for everything. If freeing local NHS commissioner leaders from competition and procurement were a strategic priority for this government, they could have done something about it. They could have abolished the purchaser-provider split if they wanted to. If they could do that with domestic law, they could do that during the Brexit process. They could have done it. They could have done it 6 years ago with the Lansley Act. They could do it at any point. They're not going to. The reason for that is that competition and procurement, although recognised as a bit of a pain for the NHS leaders, even Simon Stevens, complain about it from time to time, that it's just not a big enough deal for ministers to really put it at the forefront of whatever it is they're working on. Just note the timescales as well. The EU rules and regulations governing NHS procurement and competition aren't going to change during the Article 50 negotiating period. That will be followed, that lasts until 2019, then after that there's likely to be a transitional period. No one knows what that will actually feel like or how long it will go on for, but let's say it's 3 years, and let's say it preserves quite a lot, if not all, of the existing arrangements while the new world is sort of constructed underneath it. The EU rules governing competition procurement unlikely to change during that as well, so you can expect responsible NHS commissioners to continue to be as risk averse as they currently are, and to continue to behave in exactly the way they currently do. So likely no change for 5 years or so. This is the big stuff. The issue with workforce is uncertainty, and it comes in two forms, right? There's the uncertainty that is being endured by existing EU staff in the service, people who are already there. And then there's also the longer term uncertainty about whether freedom of movement between the EU and the UK will continue, and or in what form, or what it will be replaced by. Again, probably after the transition period, not just in a couple of years. How many staff are there? It's about 22,000 EU nurses currently working in the UK. That's not a huge proportion of the total workforce. It's only about 5-6% of the total. But here's why it's important. It's double the number by which the nursing workforce has grown since 2010. So what that means is three things. First, it means that that we've been using recruitment from the EU to rapidly grow overall nursing numbers. Second, it means that recruitment from the EU has covered what otherwise would have been a drop-off in overall nursing numbers. And third, it probably means that we've been using kind of rapid, easy recruitment from the EU, driven by free movement of people, to mitigate a lack of long-term sensible workforce planning in the UK. The government has avoided confirming whether EU staff will be allowed to stay and or what their status will be. In my view, that was a terrible mistake and is pretty indefensible. There have been two effects. First, it's just been grinding down the morale of EU staff. They've had, for nearly a year now, they've had a lack of basic security, which had been the reason that they'd come over and had given them a compelling reason to stick around and develop their careers here, or develop their life here. It's also been putting off potential recruits. And on that latter point, there is actually a hard fact. We can actually, it's rare in the Brexit debate that you can quote a hard fact, but since June, it's been reported that the number of NMC registrations from EU nursing staff is down 93%. We've also got some anecdotal cases as well. For example, I heard of an independent sector provider that does a lot of work for the NHS, not exclusively, but does, that held a recruitment event for nursing staff in Portugal. Normally when they do that sort of thing, it's not that unusual. Normally you'd expect 20, 30, 40 people to come along and see about coming to the UK to work. This time, I think it was early this year, it was 1 or 2 people showed up. Compounding the issue, again, if you're an EU worker staying here, is the exchange rate, the fall in the value of the pound. Some people, quite a lot of people who come over from the EU never intended to stay that long, so they'll come over, think, I'll do 5 years, and then I'll move to somewhere else, move back home or somewhere else. So those people might be saving money at home, they might be being paid, they might be sending some money back home, or they might be saving up their money here but be planning to move back. For those people who don't see themselves spending pounds for the rest of their lives, that exchange rate is a real pay cut. For people from the UK, it's a pain when you go on holiday. For those people, it's a pain for the rest of their lives. We also have common accounts of abuse and discrimination against EU staff from patients, and also just out in the community. And what that adds up to is the NHS becoming less competitive in the global marketplace for English-speaking clinical staff. So the challenges for the next 2 years, the Article 50 period, and or until the status of existing EU staff is confirmed, it's an emotional challenge really. It's about what people are willing to put up with. Looking ahead, there's the freedom of movement issue. That could continue there's likely to continue through the transitional period beyond 2019. The thing is that even if you're a reasonable person who thinks, well, working assumption is there'll probably be some level of freedom of movement probably till about 21, 22, something like that. That's not good enough if you're a nurse or a junior doctor from an EU country and you're thinking of moving here for 5 years, you can't make the decision to do that. It's not like just moving from Manchester to London or something. You can't do that if you don't know on what basis you will be allowed to stay. Longer term, if freedom of movement stopped, say they pulled up the drawbridge completely, there was no migration from the EU, what you would have is the recruitment from the EU would no longer be covering up that drop-off in UK-trained nurses, and that would translate through into a real workforce fall and real safety risks, because there wouldn't be enough nurses in the system. Hospitals and unions would have to close. Is that likely? No, it's not really likely. It doesn't feel likely, does it? If Amber Rudd is prepared to speculate publicly on the idea of visas for baristas, it seems to me that immigration for health workers could be allowed to continue. It would be politically pretty uncontroversial, assuming we can persuade people to come. Different jobs, longer term, different jobs could be affected differently. You can imagine a points-based system or some other immigration system where skilled workers where it's easier to recruit skilled workers like senior nurses or doctors, but a bit harder to recruit low-skilled staff from the EU. If that happened, there would actually be a really strange scenario where NHS employers or social care employers might struggle to recruit junior nurses or healthcare assistants or social care nurses because there was an overall cap that also affected, for instance, agricultural labourers or people working in hospitality. And so the NHS might be pitted against other sectors of the economy for a slice of the recruitment pie. So the likely scenario on workforce is that long term we're going to see recruitment from the EU squeezed, although via the struggle to attract staff and also via the immigration policy. And there is, for NHS leaders at the moment, a really urgent morale and uncertainty problem with their existing staff. Medicines and devices, regulation of. I'll talk about the detail about what might change in a minute, but the reason it's important, the thing to keep in mind, is that this is all about whether the UK will continue to have access to the mechanisms and the architecture that underpin free trade across the EU at the moment, and whether under a future deal we would continue to have access to them. And sometimes we hear signals from ministers that we don't want to have anything to do with things like the European Court of Justice anymore. That will involve compromises and trade-offs. At every stage there will have to be trade-offs. I didn't know the detail on this before I started, so if you're in pharma, this is probably really old hat to you. If you're outside of pharma, it might be a bit more novel. So the issue is around the European Medicines Agency. So the way to think about it is the European Medicines Agency is the thing that, on behalf of the EU, decides whether a drug is safe and fit for human consumption. NICE's job then is to decide whether, based on efficacy and value, it's worth the NHS commissioning. The European Medicines Agency is subject to the European Court of Justice. So if we want to remove ourselves from the European Court of Justice, it's hard to see how we could remain within the EMA, so we might have to come up with some sort of alternative arrangement. The EMA is currently based in London, in Canary Wharf. It will highly likely leave. That could happen quite soon, although more important is when the EMA stops being the thing that licenses drugs in the UK. That, like everything else, will depend on, nothing much will happen during the Article 50 period, and then the transitional period, it depends on the length and the character of that. So we're probably going to be covered by the EMA for a few more years. When we do come out, assuming we do come out, what might happen? Well, we could import the EMA's rules and judgments and just say whatever they say applies here, but not be subject to the European Court of Justice. The other thing that might happen is that ministers might decide it's all too difficult and just actually do a U-turn on the European Court of Justice like they did in the general election. So, I mean, who knows? But if they wanted to be within the EMA but outside of the European Court of Justice, it's hard to see how that might work. It would certainly be an unprecedented arrangement. The problem is about how disputes would be adjudicated if we didn't want to have anything to do with the ECJ. It's not been attempted before. The other thing we could do is set up our own authority to approve drugs or to license them as being fit, and have a completely different process to the European one. The attraction of that is that it might be speedier, it might be less onerous for pharma, maybe that might help persuade drugs companies that it's a good place to do business or be based. That would always have to be traded off against patient safety. The reason these agencies exist isn't to make life difficult for anyone, it's basically they exist to stop repeats of scandals like thalidomide happening again. The thing is that even if the UK wanted a really speedy process that was easier to get through than the EU's process, you're still making extra work for drugs companies. You're still creating a new set of hoops, even if it's fewer hoops, in addition to all the EU hoops that they already have to jump through. And the problem is that we're always going to be a smaller market than the rest of the EU. Approval takes time and resource. Companies are going to prioritise the biggest markets first, because if you go through the US process and the EU process, you can open up a whole a marketplace, a big marketplace, and lots of potential patients to treat in one big hit. Having our own agency, our own process, it puts us in the category of somewhere like New Zealand or Canada, which isn't exactly third world, but they tend to get medicines and devices a little bit later than the EU. That scenario would be a bit of a shock to the NHS, which is used to being the gateway to the EU. It thinks of itself as being a world-leading system. It's not used to not being at the front of the queue. It could also result in quite perverse outcomes, such as a drug being developed here based on innovations from our own universities, developed here, even potentially trialled here, depending on the arrangements for clinical trials, still being available to patients in France or in Ireland before they're available in the UK. That could be really politically quite awkward. So there are going to be clear trade-offs to be made between the extent to which, through the Brexit negotiations, the UK is willing to trade a degree of sovereignty, to pool it in organisations like the European Court of Justice or the EMA, to be traded off against the interest of patients, the safety for safety and the ability to trade freely. All of these things are going to be in the mix, and it's really unclear to see what sort of arrangement we're going to end up with. So, takeaways. No one knows what's going to happen. Don't get hung up on procurement for a while. The workforce pressures are going to increase. So like I was saying, there's an immediate thing, there's a longer term thing. I think the basic problems are that demand is going up, costs are going up, staff it's already hard for the NHS to pay for the staff it needs. The availability of the staff it needs is likely to be squeezed. That probably means that there is a need for solutions that can make the system more efficient and can safely meet patient demand without necessarily chucking loads more people at it. Longer term, there's also, I think, a piece about proper workforce planning and training as well. And that final point, that the NHS could become a second priority service for people who produce medicines and drugs. I don't have a newsletter at the moment. I recently finished writing one about new models of care, which is all still on HSJ and is still essential reading. But I'm not producing any new ones. I believe I'll be launching one with these guys on efficiency in the coming months. And now I'll hand over to Alistair and everybody else. Thank you very much.